From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening and welcome. We're very pleased to be able to present tonight's lecture in this handsome room, which is the members' room of the Library of Congress. This is a lecture by Dr. Richard Cytowic. Wednesday is Indigo Blue, How Synesthesia Speaks to Creativity. It's part of our Music in the Brain series, which has been made possible through the generous support of the Dana Foundation. We have a number of interesting events coming up this season, and if you're new to the series, please take a brochure downstairs. We have a film series coming up next week and conversations with performers like tonight's pianist Guy Livingston, who will be talking about a musician's perceptions of time, velocity, and tempo after his concert tonight. Next Tuesday, pop, trance, and electronic music. And on November 14th, music as a gateway to the sense of the divine in Sufi ritual, as a precursor to our concert by Kaihan Kalhor and Brooklyn Ryder. Tonight's presentation is really one of the most fascinating we've had in our series. Author and neurologist Richard Cytowic is an expert on synesthesia, a world authority on this subject. He's a professor of neurology at George Washington Medical Center here in Washington. In his book, which we'll be signing just afterwards here, he sums up 30 years of exploration into synesthesia's place in both science and art, revelations of a mystery that may hold a key to human creativity. Please welcome Richard Cytowic.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you all for coming. What a pleasure to be in this grand room, in this grand temple of books. I started writing my first book here in the Library of Congress in the early 80s. They gave me a carrel. They let me wander the stacks. To any scholar, that's sublime. Since we're in this important library, there's a subtext to my, the underlying theme to my talk about the nature of knowledge. Well, I came here every Tuesday for a year, and the result was this first book in English about synesthesia. A century earlier saw a French book and a German book. And right after this, this came out in 1989, and I'm sorry I can only point to one of these screens. When this came out in 1989, the color area of the human brain was first discovered. Now, you'd think something so basic as color vision would be established knowledge, but it wasn't, and I'll show you that chunk of brain as we go on. Well, here's a quick history. Textbook, The Popular Book, Man Who Tasted Shapes, another textbook, and on Wednesday is Indigo Blue, sums up 30 years of interest. I'll give an overview, end with creativity and art, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. Experience teaches me that the audiences have the most fascinating questions to ask. My co-author, David Eagleman from Baylor, can't be here tonight, but I'll be referring to his collaboration. David usually doesn't go around like Yorick, but I thought you'd like to see him. I thought you'd like to see him, and you already know what I look like. People often ask how I got involved in this curious trait and rescued it from oblivion. Complete accident. I read a tiny book about an enormous memory by the Soviet psychologist A.R. Luria, whose memory expert had a five-fold synesthesia, all the senses, so that he had all these extra hooks to hang things on. And I always liked etymology, so anesthesia, no sensation, synesthesia, joint sensation, meaning some children are born with two or more of their senses hooked together so that my voice, for example, is not only something that they hear, but also something that they see or taste or feel as a physical touch. I filed that word in the back of my mind until a dinner host chanced to say that there weren't enough points on the chicken. And for Michael Watson, who is the man who tasted shapes, flavor was more than a mouthful. Taste was also a touch sensation he felt on his face and his hands. And he wanted the chicken here on the cover to be pointed, but it came out all round. And he was very disappointed with that. And he said, With an intense flavor, he explained, a feeling sweeps down my arm and I feel shape, weight, texture, and temperature as if I'm actually grasping something. I had this cartoon drawn decades ago, so forgive the power tie on there. Well, back in 1979, none of my colleagues had ever heard of synesthesia. They refused to believe that this could be real and warned me that looking at something so weird and new age would ruin my career. They had the typical reaction of orthodoxy to something it can't explain and that defies its received wisdom. Subversive that I was, I admit it, I quietly studied Michael in depth because it interested me to explain a subjective experience that was supposedly impossible, yet which many people claim to have. So, is it real? Before I show you the proof, let's see some common types among the 150 couplings cataloged so far. Obviously, there's been a shift, and a new generation of neuroscientists in 15 countries is now studying synesthesia, churning out papers, doctoral theses, scholarly books. First, some pairings are much more common than others, such as sight and sound, or sequences that are yoked to color and spatial configuration. Ironically, the first case, Michael Watson, represents less than 1% of all instances. Secondly, synesthesia is almost always directional. It's going from sound to vision, or letters to color, but not the reverse. There are some exceptions. Thirdly, linkages are also idiosyncratic, so that not even identical twins will sense the same color combinations. And that fact, I think, was a prime reason why many people thought that synesthesias were just making this up. 30 years ago, I thought synesthesia was rare. And now we know that it's quite common. 1 in 23 people have some kind of synesthesia. The most common kind is sensing days of the week as colored. And 1 in 90 people have lexical synesthesia, meaning that letters, numerals, punctuation marks, Japanese, Cyrillic, Hebrew letters, any kind of written character induces involuntary color. And for a long time, the establishment rolled its eyes and tried to explain this away by insisting that synesthetes were just remembering childhood associations from coloring books or refrigerator magnets, and that's why A was red or E was yellow. But synesthesia runs strongly in families, as Sir Francis Galton, the British polymath, noted well over a century ago. So how could it be a childhood memory unless generations of mothers were passing down the same magnets? What Galton astutely noted was that otherwise normal people saw color whenever they looked at the visual form, the written grapheme. On the other hand, the sound units of language called phonemes tend to trigger synesthetic tastes. Now, you can imagine my mortification when a non-synesthete patient brought in this clipping, thrilled that my doctor is in the National Enquirer. But what happened is that lay people in the media became as fascinated by the trait as the establishment was as disdainful of it. The postman brought the most extraordinary things, 25-page manuscripts, letters, drawings, just trying to convey what it was that these people experienced, and also their relief at being believed for the first time after having believed themselves alone and isolated and seeing the world their way. Now, this phoneme synesthete, for this one, the word village tastes like sausage, as do similar words with the ij sound, like college and message. Derek, unfortunately, tastes like earwax, and safety like lightly buttered toast. It turns out that sounds triggering tastes tend to be present in the word for that taste. So the April taste of apricots, or Barbara like rhubarb. Childhood food names act as templates for other words that trigger tastes. Once established, the link stays stable for a lifetime. That is, A is always red, Derek always tastes like earwax. So synesthesia is genetically inherited and biological, but it requires early life exposure to cultural categories, learned categories such as letters, numbers, and food categories. Permanent links become established between sensation and a whole range of concepts because what the gene generically confers is hyperconnectivity between disparate brain areas. Now, in the case of lexical synesthesia, the colored letters and numbers, the green grapheme recognition area on the fusiform gyrus of the left hemisphere sits next to the color area called the V4. That's what I mentioned earlier. And that becomes activated by the visual appearance of the letter. When the synesthesia gene is expressed in other brain areas, you get, for example, number forms. So called because Galton, prescient again, first described a number sense existing in spatial coordinates around one's body. Nobel physicist Richard Feynman had this, and he said, "I talk about equations with tan J's and violet X's flying about, and I wonder what the hell it looks like to students." Here on the right-hand side is the circular calendar form. Note how some months take up much more psychophysical space than others. And in this one, brown November contains another internested number form for the days of the month. And the birthdays and special days are tinted a different color from the background brownness of the months of those days. David and I prefer the term spatial sequence synesthesia because what numbers, calendars, shoe sizes, temperatures, primetime television lineups have in common is that they're all overlearned sequences. He set up this virtual reality so that subjects can map out exactly where they see the elements in relation to their bodies. Number forms turn out to be fairly common. We think about 1 in 10 people may have them. You can have a number form without synesthesia. If you have synesthesia, you've got a 60% chance of having a number form. And because synesthesia is so strongly inherited, you can gather a lot of numbers of a certain type. And what we found, or David rather, is a new brain area on the right, in blue here, that cares about overlearned sequences. Like the grapheme area on the left, this newly described area sits next to the color area in red there, and voila, you've got colored number forms. Well, the fact that this is strongly heritable means that you can collect DNA from lots of synesthetic relatives. Therefore, synesthesia may be the very first cognitive trait for which science can map its gene. Think about it. A single nucleotide mutation can alter how you perceive the world. Sublime. And here's a hot spot on chromosome 16 down at the bottom. And 5 groups around the country, around the world, are pursuing narrowing down the synesthesia gene. So, that's quite remarkable. We have a top-to-bottom science of synesthesia from DNA and synapses to child development, brain imaging, psychology, and overt behavior, all the way up to creativity and art, all of which we ponder in the book. Despite having normal color vision, synesthetes often say that they see ugly or weird colors that they wouldn't deliberately choose. One colorblind synesthete speaks of Martian colors. So his retinal pigments are abnormal, but V4 is intact and being stimulated by non-optical inputs. This, of course, also argues against the childhood memory idea, because how could you remember colors that you've never seen or that you're incapable of seeing? When you scan someone while synesthetes see colors, here in yellow, when they're seeing colors in response to spoken words, and subtract out in blue the activity when they're actually looking at colors, what you get is V4, the color area of the brain. And these kinds of scans have been replicated all over. They're quite numerous now, these studies. It's been a bugaboo of mine for a long time that scans excite people because it's easy to point to the hot spots and say, there it is. But V4 is not the location of synesthesia. You can't locate synesthesia because at any given moment it exists in a spread out network of many structures. Technology is always limited, and at present we can detect activation only in the V4 node of a much bigger cognitive network. Well, to cut to the chase of what's happening in the brain, this big peak on the left, labeled A, that represents an area, say, that handles sound. And normally, excitation and inhibition are balanced in the existing feed-forward and feedback connections that everybody has, so that the sound area here, the big peak, doesn't activate some other area, like, let's say, vision or taste or whatnot. So what we think is going on over in B, that heavy green arrow, is that synesthetes have an increased excitation in existing pathways rather than extra wiring that's causing short circuits. When I started out 30 years ago, the orthodox view of how the brain was organized was called modularity. That is, each function was a self-contained unit. You know, like those plastic chips that the astronaut Dave Bowman is taking out of the HAL computer that's gone berserk in that movie in 2001. And that theory posited a language module, a vision module, a motor module, and so on. And by definition, modules did not communicate with one another. They were isolated, and that makes synesthesia impossible. So you can see why it was necessary to deny it in order to protect the theory, which, by the way, wasn't based on any physical evidence. It was completely heuristic. And I say this to show that science has fashions and paradigms that characterize an era. We've had a paradigm shift, and now we know that the normal brain is massively cross-connected. And as I said, David and I think that synesthetes have an altered balance between excitation and inhibition, and this has consequences for all of us. So the hard-nosed skeptics got the pictures that they wanted, but it was always easy to prove that synesthesia was real by much simpler means. For example, all of us can recognize a grapheme, a number, flashed in our peripheral vision. But when I surround that with other numbers, it becomes invisible. That's called masking. On the right, remarkably, synesthetes, they can't consciously say what the number is, but they say, well, it must be 7 because I'm seeing green. And this shows that synesthesia occurs very early in the perceptual process. What's called Stroop interference relies on incongruity between sensation and verbal labels, and I think this demonstration is particularly neat. Take this person who sees 7s as yellow and 9 as blue. The task is to say the math solution and then name the color square. Well, the top one's easy because the answer there is 7 and yellow. But the bottom one is hard because the automatic blueness of 9 interferes with naming the green square, tripping her up and slowing her down compared to controls. You can also demonstrate cross-sensory Stroop interference, for example, a red sound that interferes with naming a green target. The slide I showed you earlier is an example of first letter priming, so that this T gives an overall blue cast to similar words, although the individual letters are themselves colored the way they normally are. So Stroop interference proves that synesthesia is automatic, involuntary, but not that it's perceptual. And to do that, you can use tricks like perceptual grouping. You and I have to hunt to find a hidden pattern in this matrix of 2s and 5s, but synesthetes who see 2s as differently colored than 5s have a search advantage. So let's sort of summarize what we know about synesthesia to this point. Okay, it's automatic. It happens to you. There's nothing you do. You can't make it not happen. Spatially extended means that there's a sense of place. They speak of looking at or going to a certain location to look at what they're perceiving. I showed you that spatial configuration in the number forms. One of my favorites is people with colored hearing. Some of them have it's outside of themselves. It's projected on a little screen about a foot in front of their face where they see these color shapes move along. There's a college professor in Florida, and she says, my favorite music makes the lines go up. Three, it's consistent over a lifetime. Generic means it's not pictorial or imagistic. They're seeing very simple things. And when you ask what good it does, everybody says, well, it helps you remember phone numbers, any kind of categorization, directions, etc. And when you measure synesthetes' memories, in fact, they're way better than average. Some of them have what's called eidetic memory, which is popularly known as photographic memory. And then lastly, it's laden with affect. Synesthetes gush over the simplest things like a phone number or a street name. You know, they'll say, oh, they call it gorgeous or wonderful, or A is the most beautiful color I've ever seen. And so we sort of wonder, what is it that they're seeing here? No. Very often people ask, well, aren't synesthetes just being metaphoric? I mean, how is it different from saying sharp cheese or loud tie? But think a minute. Cheese isn't sharp. It's physically soft. And why use a tactile adjective to describe a taste sensation, or a taste term to describe a person, as in she's really sweet? I mean, it's circular to say that synesthetes are just being metaphoric because we don't understand how the brain represents metaphor. If we turn the argument on its head, then maybe the perceptual trait might give us a handle on the neurologic basis of metaphor and creativity. And relevant to that is colored hearing, which is the activation of color, shape, and movement by sound. Here, a cricket sound makes circles that ripple out from the center. And the little birdie makes colored bubbles. And a little yipping dog produces white circles. Now, synesthetes don't see pictorial images like sheep gambling through a field when they listen to Beethoven. Rather, they see simple configurations, geometric shapes that are consistent with the categories that Heinrich Klüver identified in the 1930s in his study of visual hallucinations. It's a bit like fireworks. Colored shapes appear, they move around a bit, and then they fade away as long as the stimulating sound is going on. In other words, it's dynamic. It's continually moving. Okay, well, you can turn that they're just making it up on its head and ask non-synesthetes to fake it on a matching task. Even when you make it simple and warn them that you're going to retest them in a week later, they fall below chance. Yet you can test synesthetes a year or more after the first session without warning and find that over 90% will agree with their initial choices. And tellingly, the misses are near ones rather than flat out wrong, because they typically need to describe the color in excruciating detail. So here on the top, the controls have 5 words for green, and the synesthetes have 54 to describe the green that they're seeing. This makes the computer perfect for sorting out synesthetes from wannabes who want to be special. Real synesthetes never want attention because they've so often been ridiculed as children. Now, David wrote this software, synesthete.org, which you can go on and log on to and test yourself if you think you're synesthetic, and you'll end up with a quantified score. The Windows color picker gives you over 16 million choices, but even then, some synesthetes complain that they can't find the exact match. Now, look on the left in the synesthete. There are 3 tiles. They're consistent over 3 tiles, except take a look at the P. The first P is slightly different shade than the others, whereas the control is all over the place, and that's reflected in the score at the bottom of the screen, the 2.7 and then 2.11 for the different subjects. Synesthete.org has been translated into many different languages, and so far has verified and analyzed 7,000 synesthetes. Far from being a mere curiosity, synesthesia is teaching us that crosstalk among the senses is the rule, not the exception. The brain is massively cross-connected. We are all inwardly synesthetes who are mostly outwardly aware of the sensory couplings going on all the time. For example, Sight, sound, and movement are normally so tightly bound to one another that even bad ventriloquists convince us that whatever is moving is doing the talking. Cinema likewise convinces us that the dialogue is coming from the actors' mouths rather than the speakers that are surrounding us. Dance is a cross-sensory mapping in which body rhythms visually imitate sound rhythms. We so take these similarities for granted that we never question them the way that we might doubt colored hearing. So minds that work differently are not so strange after all, and everyone can learn from them. For synesthetes and non-synesthetes alike, there are lawful systematic correspondences among the senses, among sensory dimensions. So, for example, both groups say that louder tones are brighter than soft tones, that high tones are smaller than low ones, and that low tones are both larger and darker than high ones. Even smell maps to bright, dark, and high-low dimensions. Both chefs and psychologists know that a darkly tinted liquid tastes and smells stronger than a pale one. And when white wine is surreptitiously colored red, we think that it tastes like red wine. Let's look at a piece of conventional music. I don't need to explain the cross-sensory mappings that are used in this demonstration. You already know them. You learned them as infants. Did you all feel yourselves bouncing synesthetically while you listened to that? I hope so. I think Chopin would have liked that. In the book, I discussed the idea of a continuum where synesthetic equivalences, Wednesday equals blue, evolve into metaphor. So the metaphor, say, ideas are light, elaborates further through language. That was a bright idea. That is, metaphor isn't some high-level linguistic abstraction. I argue, rather, that synesthesia, I just realize I can use this to the point, synesthesia antedates metaphor. And that's its perceptual similarities allow us to understand terms such as warm colors. Okay, I've shown you some of the sensory areas where the hyperconnective gene is expressed. Having one kind of synesthesia gives you a 50% chance of having a second or a third kind. But if the gene were expressed not selectively here and there, but diffusely in someone's brain, then you would have a generalized ability to relate seemingly unrelated things. And that's the definition of metaphor, seeing the similar in the dissimilar. Now, we've known for a long time, artists use metaphors with ease, and we've known for a long time that synesthesia is more common among creative people, like writers, painters, composers. Famous synesthetes include Vladimir Nabokov, whose mother, wife Vera, and son Dmitri all had it. Dmitri writes an afterword in Wednesday's Indigo Blue about his family's experiences. Now, aside from putting overt synesthesia in his books, Nabokov inserted more opaque ones for his own amusement. Take his sweeping saga, Ada or Ada. Does it mean anything? Is it merely a proper name? The book is circumspect about this, but in Nabokov's colored alphabet, ADA is black, yellow, black. Does that mean anything? I don't know. When you look at a yellow swallowtail, though, and remember that Nabokov is a published lepidopterist, we get his private joke. Douglas Copeland is another synesthetic author. I am not, by the way. People always ask that. What about other synesthetic artists? In the book, there's an excerpt from my time spent with David Hockney. for whom music arouses color, shape, mass, and movement. The mass is interesting. He talks about this being like this much blue or this much blue, and you see it in his stage sets. It's incredible. And for him, the determining factor is sequence rather than key or chords or timbre. And I want to show you a clip from Kandinsky because he combines 4 senses: color, sound, touch, and smell. Kandinsky wanted to find a universal translation algorithm that would apply to everybody, the key between the senses. And of course, we know that that doesn't work that way because synesthetic associations are idiosyncratic. So here's Carol Steen on the right, and Bill Zimmer, the art critic from the New York Times.
I think he's a synesthete, and I think his work is marvelous.
Well, I know that in his writings he equates the sound and color a lot. Talks about them in the same breath.
And there's other synesthesia. There's touch. He wrote about texture in his writing. He said, you know, colors have different feels. He said that oranges are prickly, and then he talked about dark ultramarine blues can be smooth like velvet. And then there was this other strange expression. He said, you know, there's a common expression, the scent of colors. And I don't think that's a common expression, but it shows...
The scent of colors? You mean he smelled color?
The smell of color. So I have a feeling he was a total synesthete.
Wouldn't his contemporaries think it was kind of weird?
Not only can Carol see her colors in Kandinsky's work, but Bill can identify the same shapes he sees during synesthesia.
Well, these clouds are certainly similar to the clouds that my shapes are against. This could be my shape, that it's a combination of a curved line, a sinuous line, and spikes.
So they're talking about the form constants there. Now, Carol, who you just saw in that video, she's a painter and a sculptor, and Saito represents the cerulean color, shape, and twisting movement of the first 2 syllables of my name. And when she gave this to me, I said, well, at least you made me thin. Carol rarely uses graphemes in making art because she says, quote, they hardly ever do anything interesting and unexpected. Whereas photisms that are triggered by touch or by sound do make interesting things. She loves seeing these zigzag forms. This is her absolute favorite type thing that she sees. And she likes it so much that she sculpted it in bronze as well. She says it's highly, highly pleasurable to see. That's her favorite shape. During one acupuncture session, you know, where the needle is inserted and that triggers shape and color, she said she saw a whole year's worth of sculpture flow by in 2 seconds, and unfortunately she couldn't freeze it. So, now, Olivier Messiaen is the most famous synesthetic artist. His music is so stylistically unique that you recognize it in 2 measures. He had a lifelong fascination with color, particularly stained glass, and his synesthesia was bidirectional. So when he wrote the commission for Bryce Canyon in Utah, from the canyons to the stars, Au Canyon des Étoiles, he said the music wrote itself as his eye went up the orange-red rocks of the cliff face and as that wonderfully bright blue Stellar's J flew overhead. Messiaen explicitly says that he invented a strange way of composition, which is known as the modes of limited transposition, specifically to convey the color of sound. Now, the modes aren't harmonies in the usual sense. They're not even recognized chords. Quote, they sound like colors, Messiaen says. He uses titles, such as Color of Time and Colors of the Celestial City in his compositions. He explains his intent in numerous writings and interviews, so we have lots of data with him. And he writes color names on the score so that the conductor can urge the basses to play red or the woodwinds to play blue. Parenthetically, Franz Liszt did this and bewildered his musicians with admonitions like, please, gentlemen, a little bluer if you please. This tone type requires it. And they eventually got used to their Kapellmeisters seeing colors where they saw only notes. Princeton musicologist Jonathan Bernard showed that colors correspond to the characteristic vertical spacing, the intervals of these modal chords, and that by analyzing an unannotated score with conventional musicological methods, you could correctly predict what color Messiaen said a certain section would be. Okay, well, what other kind of artists do we have here? Jazz legend Marian McPartland admits at age 91 that she never heard of the word synesthesia, but she knows for sure that D major is daffodil yellow and A is hot pink. Itzhak Perlman says that his synesthesia is more inward than an outward light show. A B bowed on the G string of the Stradivarius is a deep forest green. A on the E string is red. The next B is yellow. Stevie Wonder reminds me to say that synesthesia is very common in blind people because you don't need your eyes to see, you see with your brain. I want to note briefly the deliberate contrivances in any art form, let's say George O'Keeffe's music, Pink and Blue, or Paul Klee's polyphonic paintings, or color music per se, is not the involuntary perceptual phenomenon that we're discussing here, but rather it's art based on the idea of synesthesia. I don't have time to go into synesthetic metaphors, particularly in poetry, other than to say that it's a huge and very fascinating field. There's a large amount of colored music written and instruments on which to play them that date way back to the 1700s. Kenneth Peacock has written extensively on this. So Alexander Laszlo wrote his Farbliche Musik, Sir Arthur Bliss his Color Symphony, and Alexander Scriabin his tone poem Prometheus, which features a top stave in the score marked Luce, and a mute keyboard controls the projection of beams and clouds above the orchestra. But on the right here, Scriabin's key color combinations follows the very orderly circle of fifths, and it turns out that he borrowed his colors from Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophy fame. So Scriabin was definitely not synesthetic, despite what a lot of radio announcers say, but he was a pseudo-synesthete who fashioned deliberate contrivances. I can't speak of famous synesthetes without mentioning Marilyn Monroe. Now I've got your attention. Okay. A kiss on the cheek may be quite continental, but colors are Norma Jean's best friend. And the Mailer biography says that, quote, she has that displacement of the senses which others take drugs to find. She is like a lover of rock who sees vibrations when he hears sounds. It also provides her natural wit. There are now several documentaries about synesthetes and the science behind them. Other people made films, paintings, sculptures that attempts to convey what is it like to have this experience. And I'm going to close with what I think is one of the most delightful films by Terry Timely. He's a non-synesthete, but it speaks for itself.
Lipstick. G6. 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 Wang 6. Con 6. G6. G6.
Poof. Family life. I hope you found that as witty as I did. I just thought it was marvelous. Well, there's more to creativity than a capacity for metaphor, of course. And yet, why is the synesthesia gene maintained at such a high frequency in the population? I mean, just think, 1 in 23 people is walking around with a mutation for a very pretty but apparently useless trait. It must be doing something of inapparent value in order for evolution to select for it in such a high favor. Individuals with no family history of synesthesia are new mutations actually happening before our eyes. When the brain expresses itself in sensory parts, when the gene expresses itself in sensory parts of the brain, people are outwardly synesthetic. But what are people like when the mutation occurs in non-sensory areas, such as those concerned with memory, emotion, strategizing, moral reasoning? Does it lead to madmen? Might it contribute to increased creativity, making humans smarter as a whole? I think these are irresistible questions. Far from being a mere curiosity, synesthesia has caused a paradigm shift in 2 senses. For science, it illuminates a broad swath of the mind and forces fundamental thinking about how the brain is reorganized. It's not a mere curiosity, but it's a peephole that opens into a broad window onto the mind and the brain. All of us have a lot of crosstalk going on. Synesthesia just have more of it in existing circuits. The other shift is personal. Not everyone sees the world as you do. And not only in pure sensory terms, because synesthesia highlights how each brain uniquely filters the world in its own subjective way. I'm not about to sing Kumbaya, but it's a point worth pondering. So I hope that I've given you material to ponder, and I thank you very much for coming. And we have time for questions, and then there'll be a signing. Yes, sir.
Has anybody looked at sound to color and shape synesthete's reaction to the computer programs that play music and generate these abstract images?
Oh yeah, the music visualizers. They don't like them at all because they don't agree. And I get a lot of requests from composers of electronic music who want to know what the key is, what the translation is between sound frequency and color frequency, and for many reasons that doesn't work. For one thing, the frequency of light is not how we see colors at all. Although people always say, this reflects more red wavelengths, therefore it looks red. That's not true. So, yes, sir. And then behind you, yes.
I was reminded of a film with Richard Gere in it called Bee Season, where his son is able to be a master at spelling because all of the letters just come together mystically. And his mother also seems to have it, but she develops a delusional system. Are you familiar with that film, and is that something related to synesthesia?
No, I don't know that film. I'm going to get that from Netflix. The words will come together. That sounds more like a savant. I mean, there are people who are like incredible at anagrams. I mean, you give them a word and they'll, like this, three different anagrams. Dick Cavett was terrific at that. Savants they have like the people who see numbers and are very good with numbers. There are also people who are really good with words, and I think that may just be a high visualization. The man in front of you who had your hand up.
Are synesthetic mappings stable from individual to individual? Is there any regularity?
You mean between individuals?
Yeah.
No, not between individuals, but within, and that's what in the end of the 19th century, the people just sort of gave up because it was all idiosyncratic, and they couldn't make they couldn't make sense of it. And then came the criticism, well, if there's no agreement among the people who see colored letters, for example, then they must be making it up. So But within an individual, once the associations are established early in life, they stay stable for a lifetime. I didn't show you a really interesting thing. Of course, it would be fascinating to, one project that's happening now is looking at synesthetic children and what happens, because as they go through different developmental stages, learning phonemes, graphings, the names of colors, the names of foods that they eat, etc., do they have a different, does a certain kind of synesthesia occur during a certain developmental time that then becomes locked in? Daphne Marr at McMaster University does a lot of work with neonates, and she thinks all babies are born synesthetic, and in about 3 months, most of them lose it. And that may be true, and then it becomes, it goes under the radar of our consciousness. We're not aware of all these cross-sensory, functional cross-sensory things going on all the time. Roberta?
The same kind of graphemes, like, say, Japanese and Chinese. Do you have any information about that?
Well, people, let's say the Roman alphabet is colored, so that it doesn't matter what language they're speaking, it depends on how it's spelled. So there are Icelandic people, they have that AE, and that's a unique color. It's not the same as the other languages A or the other languages E. It's a third different color. One interesting thing that I'll bring up is that the letters 1, 0, L, and O are usually colorless. And we think this is because, and this is show this in thousands of synesthetes, is that they're natural shapes. They're a straight line, they're a circle, they're learned probably among the earliest things that we learn. Now, when you look at Chinese, Chinese 0 is this ideogram, and that is colored. But their 1, which is a horizontal line, does not have color. So it's based on, it seems to be really based on the visual form. Yes?
Is there any research into non-sense type things? In other words, if to a person letters or numbers or flavors or sounds have sexes or personalities?
Yes, gender. That punctuation marks and characters of various languages have a personality, gender, and the descriptions can go on for 2 sentences of what they're like, and they stay the same too. So, yes, it is, and there are really interesting tests that you can do to you draw. They're called cyclopean figures. So let's say you take the letter A and you use the letter A to draw a stick figure of a woman in a dress, and you do another one to draw it in a male stick figure, and then you sort of flash these to people, and that way you can, again, show that these are indeed fixed over time. There's examples of that in the book. I have a hard time seeing you all because of these lights here, so maybe you can point. I don't want to miss anybody. I do see one hand over here. So, yes, all right, let's do down here and then over there.
I was wondering if there has been any research done into the synesthetic experience with cochlear implants. I have a cochlear implant, and I've had it for 8 years. And when I was maybe about 2 weeks after being hooked up, I started noticing that I would hear sounds, and I would perceive as light, or as color, or as shape at the same time. So I'm wondering if there has been some research done in that area.
We'll have to talk at length. There's a well-known synesthete, Liddell Simpson. He's on YouTube and all that, and he was born profoundly hard of hearing. He wears 2 hearing aids, and he said, he's another bidirectional synesthete. So sound is color, and color is sound, and all. So he said, I've been deaf all my life, but silence I have never known. And he speaks of photonic hearing. so that, you know, driving along, like there's a Doppler effect. So as headlights come along, he hears the frequency of the sound increase and then decrease, and it's a little hard for him. And for bidirectional synesthetes, it can be very overwhelming. They tend to live a fairly secluded, quiet, structured life, because otherwise it's overwhelming. But normally synesthetes love having this. I mean, to lose it would be an awful state. So there was a hand over here, and that's as far as I can see into the dark.
Are there any disadvantages to being synesthetic?
Outside of the embarrassment and social ridicule and all that, no. They all, most people say that they love having it. But it can be unpleasant sometimes. So for Michael Watson, something really sour would be like a slap in the face, you know. But you get used to it, and even in those cases, they still want to do it. Now, some years ago, I looked at cognitive difficulties. As a group, synesthetes have difficulty with math, with direction finding, and right-left confusion. So people who you know, are navigating in a city that's set up on a grid, they get totally confused and turned around, etc. So, and that's held up pretty much. There's a hand here.
Hi, I just wanted to give you an example of synesthesia being a problem. I have some with sound and taste. My son has it more than I do, and he had a teacher when he was a small child whose voice brought a bad taste to his mouth, literally, and you know, he would complain about the taste that was in his mouth when the teacher talked, and I had to get his classroom changed. And that was ridiculously difficult because, you know, nobody believed it. But, and it was very hard for him because, you know, he kept saying, my teacher's voice makes me sick. And it did.
You're a great mom. There's, the gustatory synesthetes. James Wannerton in England has got a website and all that. He's the one that Derek tastes like earwax. And he owns a pub. And so all the, you know, all the names of things, and even his girlfriend's name, you know, he's like, ugh. But you know, somehow he copes with all that. It just becomes the texture of your reality. Some people sometimes say, wow, isn't it confusing to see all this extra stuff, you know? Doesn't it drive them crazy? And I say, well, no more than a blind person saying to you, gee, everywhere you look, you're always seeing something. Doesn't it bother you always having to see everything all the time? And the answer is, well, no, because this is the texture of our reality. And synesthetes have a different texture of reality. Any on this side here?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering if there was any study in terms of the synesthetes, especially the visual and the musical, being sort of a way to help the non-synesthetes sort of get at another sort of space in their brains. Because I mentioned when you talked about Kandinsky, his early sort of more realist paintings don't do anything. When I started seeing his geometrical abstractions, there was something that I just couldn't get away from. And it's almost like being a conduit to something. And the light organ as well, I imagine for some people, it might open up a different part of their connections that isn't overt. And I'm wondering if that might be an indication of some sort of less conscious, or how the connection of non-synesthetes' reactions and resonance with some of the synesthetes, what does that mean, if anything?
Well, I mean, you talk about having an experience with art, and that's why art is so wonderful. It speaks to us, and we can't put it in words about why it's quite so wonderful. It speaks to you, yeah. With that clip I showed of the Chopin valse, for example, the Valse Brillante is from the Music Animation Machine by Stephen Malinowski. And that has turned into a teaching tool, because when I look at the different pieces that he's coded in that way, I'm seeing and hearing things in pieces that I know very well, and I thought, oh, look, there's a triad, but the middle one is, you know, it's a dissonance, you know, so you do see more of it. In the same way, for example, that looking at a harpist, I mean, I can't imagine harp music without looking at the beauty of the motions of producing that music. So, you know, I wish we're like the Matrix, that we could sort of download a DVD to our brain and understand this experience, you know. But it takes time, and, you know, the bigger point is that all of us have incommensurable experiences at some level, that our subjective experience, what did Hans Zimmer say? The best things can't be said. You simply can't convey them. Where else?
To comment on what you were talking about, being able to see the Chopin, if our pianos were reversed and we had the high notes in the left hand and the lower, and we're all reading music. Most of us probably took some kind of music lessons. So we're reading it the way we read a score, and yet a high note, if it were in your left hand and the low notes in your right hand, the score would look, I mean, are we pre-adapted? Is our learning affecting the way that we read that music in colors?
Well, I mean, yes, we're all culturally conditioned, and so much so that we don't realize it. So I think probably the way that music notation came about, it has actually music notation is an interesting kind of language because it's a two-dimensional kind of language. Yes, sir. Here you had a.
Have there been cases of this phenomenon being brought on by brain damage, such as stroke?
Yes, I didn't show a slide on the acquired synesthesias. So let's see, sensory deprivation. You know, the tranquility tank, or elderly people, they lose their vision a little bit, their hearing a little bit, their feeling a little bit. That can bring on synesthesia. Head trauma, tumors. There's some famous cases of an artist who had an accident. He had a car accident, after which he became colorblind and he lost his synesthesia. He also is no longer able to dream in color. Yes, sir.
Similarly, is there any discussion on whether it could be trained or learned?
No, there's actually there's a very good experimental setup in which they did exactly that, to try to teach controls to learn, let's see, it was sound color and word color associations. They trained them intensively. They did the functional magnetic resonance scans, and the experience was not the same as what synesthetes reported, and the scans showed no activation in the areas that the synesthetes were activating when they did the same kind of tasks. And of course, for them, they didn't have to struggle to do it. So it's been pretty conclusively shown that you cannot teach this, that synesthesia is not a matter of learning or even overlearning.
Is there any correlation, excuse me, Richard, is there any correlation between synesthesia and IQ or synesthesia and autism?
Yes. Three conditions linked together, synesthesia, epilepsy, and autism. Daniel Tammet, who is the European holder of being able to recite pi by memory, has an autobiography called Tuesday is a Blue Day, Born on a Blue Day, Born on a Blue Day. So yes, there is a link between that. Yes?
What's the relationship between synesthesia and emotion?
Well, as I showed on one of those slides, point number 5 is that there's a lot of affective loading. So, in fact, one of my earliest ideas decades ago was that the limbic system, the emotional brain, was where the connection went together, because that's one place among several options where all the senses and emotion and memory converge. And that turned out not to be true. It didn't pan out, so we had to think of something else. That's the beauty of science. You know, you can be wrong, and then you just pick yourself up and go on. Yes, for most people, there's a big wow factor or a yuck factor, you know. And then for Sean Day, who runs the synesthesia list, he's a linguist in South Carolina. When his wife goes away, he goes on a blue binge, and because he has colored taste, and so he eats all these foods that are blue. And his favorite recipe is chicken a la mode, and it's a baked chicken breast with orange juice concentrate and vanilla ice cream on top. And he says, I know it's disgusting, but it is just the most wonderful blue. I mean, you sort of get a sense that this is better than an orgasm, you know. And there's a chapter on orgasm. People have colors and shapes with orgasm. So, that is like the emotional, you know. And you know, people were reluctant to talk about that, but no, now they do. And it's amazing. It's amazing. Somebody said, this will sound crazy, but my favorite orgasms are these brown squares, and my husband doesn't understand it, but he's very happy when I have them. So, how's our time? Please feel free to get up and go, and then we're going to do a signing. So
we just want to thank Richard Cytowic so much, and we're sorry to rush you out. We have to get the concert ready. Please join him over here for the book signing.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.